I'm Carol Cole from the Social Science Department. This is part of the Oral History Project. The filmmaker is Mark Gaynor. This is May 9th. Today is May 9th, 1995, and we're doing an oral history of Richard Strider, who we'll turn to now. And if you would tell us your title, your present title, and a little about what positions you've held in it.
Yeah, well, my current title is Executive Director of the Educational Foundation for the Fashion Industry. I'm completing my 22nd year at FIT, and I initially came to the college as Dean of Students back in 1973. Prior to that, I was at Pratt Institute, where I was also Dean of Students, and I remember writing a letter to Martin Feldman, who was then president of the college, and I had been sending my resume to a variety of institutions in the New York metropolitan area, and I received a call from President Feldman asking me to come to the college to meet with him. We spent about an hour and a half together, and then before I knew it, I was in the middle of a whole interview process which involved 3 separate committees. As I recall, there was an administrative committee, there was a faculty association committee, and there was a Division of Student Affairs search committee. Well, lo and behold, a couple of months later, I resigned my position at Pratt, and I joined the Fashion Institute of Technology. Quite frankly, it's a very nostalgic moment to be recounting both 22 years of the college's history plus 22 years of my own life. And the institution was very different at the time. Basically, when I arrived, we had the C building, and we had the C building, and we had the C building. That was our one facility. Although we did have a dormitory, which was Nagler Hall. Nagler Hall at the time was an all-female dormitory. And I recall a couple of years later when we opened up the new dormitory, which we chose to call Co-Ed Dorm. So for the first time in the history of the college, we had the male and female students living in the same dormitory. When I first arrived at the college, the Division of Student Affairs was not structured quite the same way as it was shortly after my arrival. The admissions and registrar's office, for example, reported to the assistant to the president at the time, who was Dr. Otto Safir. My feeling, which I expressed to Feldman, was that student services should be a comprehensive set of services, and to have it fragmented with the registrar admissions components reporting elsewhere didn't make sense, since the other departments, such as financial aid, housing, placement, all had some connectedness to admissions and registration and registrar function. So almost immediately, Feldman agreed to reintegrate admissions and registrar into the Division of Student Affairs. There had been a Dean of Students for several decades, who was almost a legendary figure around the college. Her name was Marion Brandress. I think Brandress felt that things, if I heard correctly from my colleagues at the time, felt that the college was changing in ways that she was not particularly comfortable with, and so she decided to retire after many years. There was an associate Dean of Students, Mary Jones, and she was the Dean of Students for a year. She similarly, I guess, again, this is all sort of recollection, impressions, and what people said. Mary decided that being the chief student affairs officer was a little bit more stressful and frankly frenetic than she had pictured it to be. So she retired, which left the opening for chief student affairs officer, which is Richard Strider, in the picture. I also recall at the time we had no health service. We had a periodic visit from an octogenarian physician from the Department of Health in the city of New York, and we had a nurse on campus. who was not able to even give an aspirin to a student or faculty member. Basically, it was a record-keeping function and a referral function. So if a student was very ill, Kay Leslie, who was the nurse at the time, would essentially refer students to the emergency room at a local hospital. I felt it was essential, especially with the residential population of students, to in fact have a health service. And I began to lobby the president to allow me to move forward in creating a comprehensive primary care health service for the students at the college. In order to avoid having this be an enormous financial drain on the institution, I approached the leadership of student government at the time and suggested that we set up what I described as a modified social health program that would be largely funded through the student activity fee, which would incorporate a health service component that would be built into the student activity fee. That process worked extraordinarily well, and so in rather short order, I hired a physician who was a wonderful woman by the name of Dr. Martha Cottrell, who became the doctor who was in charge of running the health service, and Kay Leslie continued, and all of a sudden she in fact, she was a registered nurse, and all of a sudden she was able to perform the functions of a trained RN working with Martha Cottrell. And that service over the years, particularly when the new buildings opened up in the mid-70s, a health service facility was part of the A building building program, and we wound up with sufficient space to build that service over the years, which came to include a testing facility, so that blood work, basic tools for a physician to make a diagnosis was available on campus. And it was very important because students tended to wait until they were deathly ill before they would even consider going to a hospital emergency room where they would sit and wait for hours. So the health service, I think, has been a great addition to the college, and it's certainly served the student body very well over the years. It was also a time of fun and growth. There was a wonderful esprit de corps on campus. I remember meeting with the deans of the other art and design colleges in New York City. As a matter of fact, I initiated creating a council of deans of students that represented Parsons, Visual Arts, Cooper Union, Pratt Institute, and FIT, to find ways of working together, whether it was a matter of easing student transfer, sharing information. And then at one meeting, I suggested that we might want to have some type of a costume party, to have the students from all of the various art schools participate in an evening of fun, and to let their creative juices flow in terms of designing costumes. And by the end of the meeting, we decided we would call this the Mardi Gras Costume Ball. So the first year, I recall calling the Landmarks Preservation Commission and asking if we could have a gathering of art students at the Customs House in Battery Park. Well, the people on the Landmarks Preservation Commission, I'm sure, assumed that we were going to be having all of these art students coming to admire the frescoes and the architecture of the Customs House, and what the students really were coming for was to have a grand old party. Well, we had about 1,800 students in the most outrageous costumes you can imagine. We had a first prize, as I recall, of $750, a second prize of $500, and a third prize of $300. And the students really outdid themselves. And we had refreshments included wine and potato chips and things like that. And the party started about 8, and it was supposed to run until 2. And at 1 o'clock, I closed the party down. There were students throwing up on the marble floors The bathrooms, which probably hadn't been used in God knows how many years, were overflowing. And out of, I guess, fear of destroying this wonderful landmark building, I decided that discretion was the better part of valor. At 1 o'clock, just called the party to a halt. And the next morning, the telephones of every one of the presidents was ringing off the hook with people from the Landmarks Preservation Commission, somewhat hysterical that the building was in horrible condition. Well, I had planned from the very beginning to have a crew go in the first thing in the morning, and which is what happened. In a matter of probably 4 or 5 hours, I think I had 20 buildings grounds people. They had the place spotless by 1 o'clock, and quite frankly, we left it in better condition than we found it. But there was no way that the commission was going to allow us to use the building the following year. So I then went to put over here on 34th Street to the old Manhattan Center, and it was being run by the Moonies. I think it still probably is owned by them. And again, I talked about a party of art students and so on and so forth. So this became an annual hit-and-run operation. A good number of students came in drag, and the Moonies absolutely freaked out when they saw this. And so that year...
By drag, you mean cross-dressing?
Yes. So that year we had, again, a wonderful party, but we were not to return to the Manhattan Center. And so the third year, the dean of Parsons at the time was Vieri Salvadorian, who's become a very good friend. But in any event, we went to the Copacabana, and quite frankly, they couldn't care less how people dressed, what they did, whatever. They were used to having real parties, and so we had a safe haven. And so we had the Mardi Gras Costume Ball at Copacabana for 2 years. And then I think after 4 years, sort of our energy level and the amount of time that went into putting these types of grand parties together waned somewhat. And so that was basically a 4-year stint. Also on campus, Nancy Grossman and some of the staff that worked for me at the time suggested that we have a faculty staff talent show. And everyone on the faculty and staff, some of the administrators, really got into the spirit of putting on a show for the students without any fear of being laughed at or whatever. I mean, it was sort of just good fun, and to show the students that, you know, we are real people who can have a good time, and who are very interested in having them have a good time, and somewhat at our expense. I recall the first year, I got dressed up in a zoot suit, and one of the black students that I was very friendly with, I knew had some wonderful hats, and he had this white fedora. So I asked him if I could borrow this big white fedora for the talent show. And I pulled together a 4-piece jazz band in my former life. I was a professional trumpet player. And as I recall coming up on stage, I had dark glasses on, and I lit a cigarette and smoked it as if it were a joint, and everybody was laughing. Kids were all laughing, thinking this was sort of just a spoof. And I then picked up the horn, and we had rehearsed a couple numbers. And I started with this sort of Miles Davis bluesy type of sound coming out of the horn. And first 3 notes, all of a sudden there was this ooh that came out of the audience, because the students were singing this was going to be really, you know, some real music, and it wasn't just, you know, it wasn't just a gag. The second year, I modeled some things that came up with the show. And in the third year, and we were downstairs. We still had, I think we were still in the C building, the Dean of Students office, and the registrar and admissions office were on the first floor of C building. And I remember Jim Purdy, who was then director of admissions, asked me in front of about 4 people what I was planning to do for the talent show that year. So I said, well, Jim, what's in? What do you think would be kind of fun? Well, he said, you know, if you read the papers, streaking is in. I said, thanks a lot. That's, you know, that's very helpful. And I thought about it for several days, and I thought, maybe Jim's right. You know, it'd be kind of a hoot. So this was orchestrated and planned very carefully. I was at the back of the auditorium, the Haft Auditorium. It was pitch dark, and Gene McKenna, who was at that time head of the counseling center, he was emceeing the event. And Holly Mayer, who was director of financial aid at the time, had just finished sort of this semi-operatic soprano number. The students weren't sure whether to take it seriously or not. So there was some laughs, some giggling during the performance. But anyway, when she finished, the signal from McKenna was, well, it's spring. And at that point, when I had gone out and I had bought the most, the tiniest micro bikini, flesh-colored, that I could find in the marketplace. And I had a sign about as big as this piece of paper that just had, in big letters, in big black letters, it had love. And I had a bouquet of flowers. So here I am at the back of the auditorium. I have this bouquet of flowers under this trench coat, and my sign said love. So with this signal, it's spring, off went the trench coat. And it was standing room only. I was in the back of the auditorium behind that little wall. Off goes the trench coat, and I head down the left-hand aisle. So I have the wall to my left, I have the bouquet of flowers in my left hand, and I have this sign on my hip, which said love. Well, I must tell you, every student in the audience thought I was completely naked, and then all I had was this sign which said love. I got up onto the stage, I ran as fast as I could, flung the flowers out into the audience, and went across the stage behind curtains. Well, pandemonium existed in the auditorium for 3 or 4 minutes. And for about 2 years, they called me Streaking Strider. And it was funny because at commencement that year, which was at that time in Carnegie Hall, I was sitting next to Helen Lefkowitz, who was the Attorney General's wife at the time. And the student body president was making a valedictorian speech. And it was just, he was sort of reminiscing about his time at FIT. And he said, who would have thought we would have seen the dean streak? And he just sort of mentioned that en passant, and it continued. Helen Lefkowitz, sitting next to me, says, Richard, who is that? I said, Helen, that was me. Well, she blushed. And that year, if you go back to the yearbook, which would have probably been, I think, 1976, if I'm not mistaken, you have this blurred nude figure. The student who was probably a photography major, who was taking pictures, had the f-stop on a rather slow speed, not expecting any fast movement. So as I was racing down the left-hand side of the auditorium, he took a photograph of me running. And so all you see is this blurred nude figure, which was kind of an interesting memento of the event. But sort of getting back, to some of the early days, it was really a time I would almost call it the Camelot years of FIT. Marvin Feldman was an extraordinary leader, an extraordinary visionary, who really had invested most of his professional life in vocational education. He was considered by many people in higher education throughout the United States as one of the foremost spokespersons for vocational education. And he had an extraordinary vision of FIT, an extraordinary vision of FIT that really provided a blueprint for the future growth and development of the institution that really lasted for at least a couple of decades. And I think clearly his influence is still very much with us today, and I hope it will be with us forever as an institution. I essentially came to a relatively small community college, not terribly well known, with some very good programs. But again, it was a small college and not particularly well known nationally or internationally. Feldman had a vision of the institution growing in some rather extraordinary ways. And he felt that the industry was our client, as were the students who came to FIT. Feldman fairly quickly, came up with a concept of developing a very unusual approach to higher education for a college such as FIT, which was basically his idea of a 2+2 curriculum. And essentially inherent in that 2+2 curriculum was also a sense that the associate level program was the building block, the foundation of a student's education, and really should be sacrosanct. And despite the fact that he felt that we had to be more responsive to industry and to also to our students in terms of baccalaureate education, I mean, he stressed constantly and urged the faculty and the trustees never to lose sight of the importance of the associate level program, which he described as sort of the liberating force in a young person's life who may, for a variety of reasons, not be able to stay for an additional 2 years. And in some instances, he felt the programs were absolutely adequate towards preparing people for industry in the 2-year period, and therefore there was no need for them to stay on for an additional 2 years. And to this day, there are a number of programs at the college that remain terminal programs at the end of the 2-year associate program. When he first began talking about upper division education, baccalaureate education, there were a lot of people within the state who were not particularly supportive. The private institutions were certainly opposed to FIT expanding its educational options to the students because they felt it would severely encroach upon their enrollment, both from the state of New York as well as nationally and internationally. And I remember going with Marvin to Regents Coordinating Council meeting because essentially the State Ed Department does a survey and seeks to find out how other institutions in the state feel about new program initiatives that institutions within the state have applied for. And I remember doing some homework for Marvin in terms of getting trained, because I had been dean at Pratt. It was very easy for me to do research in terms of the number of transfer students. Actually, I had the registrar's office go a little crazy in terms of transcripts over a 10-year period that have been sent or requested by students to be sent to Parsons, Pratt, Visual Arts. And the research produced some interesting results, which showed there were a very, very small number of students over the years that had ever sought to apply to those institutions upon graduation from the 2-year program at FIT. So it was a way of diffusing the arguments made by the privates that this would severely, again, hamper their enrollment situation and would drain FIT graduates who they were taking a position would normally have applied to their colleges. Anyway, to make a long story short, Marvin was very impatient to get the baccalaureate programs approved and in place, and rather than going through the traditional route, which was taking too long, he went to his political friends in Albany. In particular, there was one gentleman who became the champion of FIT. His name is Billy Passanante, and Billy was the Speaker Pro Tem of the New York State Assembly. So we in fact have an FIT bill that was passed by the legislature authorizing FIT to offer baccalaureate education. Marvin's vision didn't stop at baccalaureate education. He then had the audacity, in the opinion of several people within SUNY and other parts of the state, to seek graduate status, graduate program status for the college. And again, Passanante had it legislated, so there is in fact another bill authorizing FIT to offer master's degree programs at the college.
What was Passanante's position in terms of the legislature?
He was the Speaker Pro Tem of the State Assembly. So he was a very influential politician.
Was he local? Was he from...
Yeah, he represented Greenwich Village, essentially, which was his catchment area. And he and Marvin became very good friends, and Marvin cultivated a lot of the important politicians in Albany. Spent a fair amount of time in Albany every year. And so when it came time for things that came before the legislature that affected FIT, he had a lot of friends upstate who were very supportive. And again, he constantly focused. I mean, his departing speech when he retired from the fight, and he retired because he was quite ill at the time, was that we, as an institution, should never forget the importance of the associate level program. And he feared that there would be a natural tendency on the part of all departments to press for purposes of status and prestige, etc., to pay attention to the baccalaureate and forget the importance of the associate program. I think we tried to continue to protect that, and I hope that it stays with us in the future. In any event, it was a very exciting time of new programs and growth and development, and new buildings came online, and I remember sitting in my office saying, what are we going to do with all these new buildings? We went from, again, having essentially just the C building to a campus that came to comprise 8 buildings, 5 of basically academic in nature, and 3 dormitories. And I felt we'd be rattling around in all this new space, and quite frankly, it didn't take but a couple of years before essentially we had filled every nook and cranny of the campus, and it wasn't too many years thereafter that we already felt we were short of space again. So again, it was a very exciting time to be part of the administration of the college, with all of these new things happening and the student body growing, both in terms of students from the city, students from the state, students from across the country. The international student body grew significantly, which I think was very important. It was always my feeling that students learn as much from each other as they do from faculty, and I think this is true on virtually all campuses. And I think when you also have a major part of your institution, which is design-oriented, students bring a different aesthetic sensitivity and sensibility with them from the countries from whence they come. So having a classroom of design students with students from India, from Europe, from Africa, from all parts of Asia, Latin America, brings something very special to the classroom, which I think elevates the overall quality of what students come away with, because again, I think they pick up a lot through osmosis and being exposed. I mean, students, again, from a different background, have a different color sense, given the countries they come from, a different design sensibility. And students are constantly looking at each other's work, being influenced by each other's work. And quite frankly, in more than 2 decades that I've been here, the entire industry that we serve has gone through a globalization process. So again, I think there are equally strong benefits in terms of students interacting with each other who can help broaden the ability of our students to relate to individuals who come from very, very different backgrounds. And also during that period of development, we expanded our international program substantially to encompass all kinds of semester abroad programs overseas, summer abroad programs overseas. Because again, I think it's, and Feldman was a great supporter of it, and I think Hirschfield has spoken on the subject as well, that students ideally should have at least one overseas educational experience during their tenure at FIT as students. I think that helps make them more marketable, makes them certainly much more knowledgeable in terms of the international economy, which no company, I think, can afford to not participate in if they wish to survive and have any growth potential for the future. So international education, again, was a very important hallmark, I think, as far as growth is concerned.
Now, you were involved in, I think, the international education program here? Well,
not initially. I served as Dean of Students for about 13 years. Then in 1985, I remember sitting in Feldman's office upstairs, and he began to talk about a program that he hoped to be launched in Florence, Italy. There was a meeting that took place between Shirley Goodman and a woman by the name of Ruth Rabb, whose husband was the American ambassador to Italy. they met in Rome in a social occasion and talked about the desirability of establishing a mini version of FIT in Florence, which would benefit both the Italian fashion industry and also benefit FIT. And that program started to take serious shape in '85, and Feldman asked me if I would be interested in heading it up. Well, quite frankly, since I was not bilingual, I spoke Russian at the time, French, but I did not speak Italian. I felt it was essential to find someone who spoke Italian. I also thought it would be an enormous personal sacrifice to uproot and move to Italy, and so I declined. And I remember sitting in his office one evening, which we often did, just to review the events of the day and what was going on. Marvin told me he had gone through the entire FIT catalog, and he couldn't think of anyone who could serve as director of this new school to launch it in Florence. And contrary to what a lot of people believed at the time, and maybe still do, I sat and I said, well, when I thought about it, I think there's an excellent candidate to head up that school in Florence, and I think we should consider Alan Fishman. Well, Alan Fishman was Shirley Goodman's son, and Shirley was the executive director of the Educational Foundation, is the position I currently hold. Shirley had been acting president twice. She was executive vice president of the college for many years. And so when Marvin offered Alan Fishman the job, speculation on campus was that Shirley had pressured Feldman to hire her son, Professor Fishman, to take on that assignment. It absolutely was not the case. I felt that Alan was bilingual Italian. He had studied in Rome for quite a long period of time. That I had worked on some committees with Alan, and I thought he would bring a lot of energy and a great desire to make this project succeed. And, so in any event, Alan Fishman, in fact, went off to Florence to be the first director of this new school. And about 8 months later, a project which had been talked about for a long time, but nothing had come to fruition, involved setting up a similar institution in New Delhi, India. And one evening, during one of these regular discussion sessions with Marvin, I began to ask him questions about the India project. And he sort of turned to me and said, why are you asking me about India? I said, you're not interested in going to India, are you? I said, well, it's a possibility. He said, Strider, you are one crazy SOB. He said, almost a year ago, I offered you the opportunity to go to Florence and you turned me down. And now you're asking about, and even thinking about possibly going to India? He said, I don't understand that at all. I said, well, look, I am by nature partially a social worker. And having been in India, I said, I love Florence, it's a wonderful city. I said, India is a country with great need. And if I can make even a microscopic contribution, I felt, and also indicated to Marvin that the one thing in my life that I regretted not doing was having served in the Peace Corps. And I said this was, in my opinion, not exactly the same, but something quite similar. Anyway, to make a long story short, I made 2 trips to India in May of 1986 and August of 1986. They were basically planning meetings, and then in September, I physically moved to New Delhi and got off the plane, and it was as if they weren't expecting me. There was no office, there was no secretary, no staff. Basically, they had arranged a hotel room for me. They did not follow through on what they had promised, which was to find me housing, an office, staff, etc. So without boring you with too many of the details, after about 2 weeks of some meetings, I finally met with one of the senior government officials, and I said, look, I really got 3 choices. I can sit in my hotel room and play the highly paid consultant and send people, and I will give them my best advice and counsel. I can pack my bags and go home, which is another option, because I didn't come here for a junket. This is a very serious project, and the government of India is investing a lot of money And I said, thirdly, I can roll up my sleeves and open a china shop and get this damn college off the ground. And the gentleman I was meeting with, who was a senior advisor on cultural affairs and educational matters, turned to me, and we were meeting in the International building in New Delhi at lunch, and turned to me and said, Richard, you must become the czar of this project. And I said, Mapu, that is what I will do. And by January, I had the first program launched. Professor Hilda Friedman from the Fashion Design Department, who is an outstanding faculty member who really knows her onions. She had been a consultant for Shankar in Israel, going back years before that. Was just an outstanding master of teaching design, pattern making, and draping. And so we began our first program. I basically revised the curriculum for the programs that were going to be offered, designed the furniture, the admission system, did all the public relations, recruited the students, the faculty. I was like a whirling dervish. And I averaged probably working 12, 15 hours a day. It was a labor of love, but again, my feeling was if this college was to come into being, all of this work just had to be done. I remember my wife coming to New Delhi to spend a month that summer, and at that point I had gotten a shopping arcade in one of the quote 5-star hotels, and designed the space to become classrooms and offices. And as you'll find in many shopping arcades, there were no windows. New Delhi in the summer is also perishingly hot, and my wife came to the office the first day after her arrival, and there I was sitting with 6 candles on my desk. The air conditioning system was out because the generator at the hotel, the power for the area was out, the backup generator at the hotel wasn't working, and so there I was in probably 115-degree temperature in this enclosed space with 6 candles on my desk, working away, perspiring while I worked. And she came in and said, I think your mother must have dropped you on your head. You may want to sit and work, but I am going home where it's air conditioned, so she left and went back. In any event, it was an extraordinarily successful project. The college opened up a brand new campus about 8 months ago in New Delhi. I've seen photographs of it. I haven't seen the facility. It's called the National Institute of Fashion Technology. And I essentially recruited the faculty and sent them to FIT for a year of training, so that despite the fact they had industry experience, I put them each through a 1-year program in their specialization area. Worked with the different departments to select a senior professor to serve as a mentor to these faculty trainees, and help them with lesson plan development, curriculum development. So again, the purpose of us spending a year here was to actually take all the coursework in the 1-year program. Some of them had been one of them, for example, had been an FIT grad. I still felt he had to go through the program again with a different eye in terms of how the material is presented. How you go from day 1 through a 16-week semester was critical. And so the 1-year training program became an essential component for cultivating the faculty that would ultimately be the faculty of this new college. And at the same time, we had visiting faculty from FIT. Evan Namath was another faculty member who taught in India. Mort Silverstein taught in India, Elaine Stone taught in India. In any event, it's one of those rare developing country projects that I think has had a life of its own. After the foreign consultants have left, the project did not go down the tubes, and it continues to be a very viable institution in India.
What's our linkages now?
Our linkages are basically collegial and supportive. We have continued to train faculty from NIFT. I mean, that's what the acronym is, NIFT. Not in great numbers. I mean, 1 a year, 2 in 1 year, summer courses, etc. I mean, one of the things I wanted for this institution was to not become dependent upon FIT. As a matter of fact, I took one of the senior Indian government officers who was assigned to work with the college. I took him to London, I took him to Paris, I introduced him to educators at institutions in England, institutions in France, so that this institution in India would have linkages in Europe as well as the United States, because my feeling was that India's market was Europe as well as the United States. And so I felt that I had a responsibility to broaden the resource network that would be available to this new college.
What role have the various fashion industries played in the development of this college and FIT and that direction you've taken?
Well, we had a local advisory group that was called Friends of NIFT, and we had industry people in New York who served on that council. Italy, the Polymotor project essentially has had most of its support from the industry in Florence, Italy. It was funded through the city of Florence, the state of Tuscany. Florence lies within the state of Tuscany. And a good deal of the funding, again, came from local industry in Florence to develop this. Florence obviously has made a far better site for exchange programs because of the importance of the Italian fashion industry in the world of fashion. For most of our students, the opportunity of studying in India has not been particularly appealing because India basically has been a contracting country. They export a lot of apparel, but there's very little original design, so India certainly would not be considered one of the fashion capitals of the world. We have had a few students over the years who were interested in spending some time in NIFT, but it's not been really significant at all. In any event, when I returned to FIT in I think it was January of 1988, there were some political problems going on in the institution that involved the treasurer of the college. There had been some accusations of malfeasance, misfeasance, whatever. And without any of these charges having been proved, as a matter of fact, someone had gone to the Department of Investigations of the City of New York with some allegations of wrongdoing on the part of the treasurer. That launched the whole investigation, which caused the institution and Feldman a lot of angst and anxiety. The investigation never came to any conclusion one way or another, except they sent in some of their investigators and picked up huge cartons, large cartons in this very office. This is the office that Fred Blatt occupied for the years that he was the treasurer of the college. And they just came in summarily, removed every document they could get their hands on, and walked out with a truckload of paperwork. And to make a long story short, Blatt left shortly thereafter. Not particularly voluntarily, I might add. And Feldman asked me if I would serve as vice president of administration. Quite frankly, I wasn't particularly interested. I loved working with students. I enjoyed being dean of students and being responsible for security in the computer center and purchasing in the mailroom and all those other good things that involve administration. Certainly didn't seem to me, it seemed eminently doable. At the same time, I didn't feel it would be professionally rewarding to go from student affairs to administration. And so I turned Feldman down. He called me back a week later and said, look, you love international things, you're very good at it. He said, why don't we combine vice president for administration and international affairs? I said, Marvin, why are you doing this to me? I said, you know, I'm very much in love with the student body at the college. I enjoy student affairs work, and to give it up, it was very difficult for me to countenance. And he turned to me, and I'll never forget it. He said, Richard, Dick, actually, when he was, I always knew how Marvin was feeling by whether he called me Richard or Dick on a particular day. Insofar as he was trying to woo me on that occasion, he said, Dick, he said, I'm not asking you, he said, I'm begging you. He said, I really need you to do this job for me. Well, I mean, essentially, I like to consider myself a team player. I was also terribly fond of the man, had enormous respect for him, and he was going through a difficult period, and it was impossible for me to say no. I finally agreed, reluctantly, I might add, and so this would have been sometime during 1978.
Okay.
Anyway. In any event, I took on the responsibilities for Vice President for Administration and International Affairs. I think one of the goals of any administrator, any person in the business world, is to leave behind something better than what you found. So the things I felt needed improving, I felt that the same philosophy I brought to student affairs, which was to be very client-centered and very client-oriented. I think a lot of institutions quickly forget that the reason for being is to serve students. And so my whole philosophy was the student is our client. And I remember making speeches to the departments I supervised, indicating that every student should be treated the way Tiffany treats anyone walking in the door, whether they're dressed in green jeans or a tuxedo. And I felt that the service departments of the college should equally be responsive to the faculty, the administrators, and the students, whether it was security. I remember getting them out of uniforms and put them into blazers and a tie and a shirt, upgrade their sense of what they're doing, how they're doing it, but also to send a very different message to the people who inhabit the Fashion Institute of Technology, and to make them more of a user-friendly service. Anyway, I did that for a number of years, and probably 5, which would have brought us certainly into the 80s. It was probably 1992. Richard Martin, who was the executive director of the foundation and head of the Resource Center, resigned. He had applied for the presidency, was turned down. He had been doing graduate studies and had been removed from that position. And the foundation board terminated his services as executive director of the foundation. And so rather than go back to the Resource Center to simply be the executive director of the Shirley Goodman Resource Center, Richard left and went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where he became curator of costume. Marvin, Pete Scote's chairman of the FRT board, approached me and asked me if I would, for a very short period of time, 6 weeks or so, would I take on being acting director of the Educational Foundation and acting director of the Shirley Goodman Resource Center, while at the same time maintaining my responsibilities as vice president for administration and international affairs. So for about a year I wore 4 different hats, and quite frankly cleaned up somewhat of a mess that I found the foundation in. I felt it had been very poorly administered. The board had very little idea what was going on, and so I prepared a very lengthy analysis of just about everything that the foundation was involved with, and we submitted this report to the board. Had some real fun working with a fabulous group of people in the design lab, put on some exhibitions that I got very much involved with, and my creative juices were flowing at the time. I just enjoyed the incredible staff people over in the design lab, and we put on, because Richard had left behind a broken commitment to put on an exhibition in celebration of BNR's 100th anniversary, and didn't tell anyone at the BNR. BNR is the Daily News Record. It's the menswear organ for the fashion industry. It's Women's Wear Daily is for women's wear. And in any event, I got a call from Scote's indicating that there was a problem and some very angry people, and would I intervene and see what I can do. And in 5 weeks, we had a menswear exhibition opening in the Shirley Goodman Resource Center, which the menswear industry and BNR in particular were thrilled with. A number of months later, I met with the senior people in the design lab, and there was some talk about Richard having made a commitment, Richard Mark having made a commitment to show 12 gowns that Charles James had designed for a particular client. And she had passed away, and the husband was promised that there would be some mini little show. Well, I suggested to the staff in the design lab that we mount a major retrospective of Charles James. And so, a good number of months later, we put on what I consider to be one of the most beautiful exhibitions that FIT had ever had, showcasing the work of Charles James, who was the fashion designer, who was a design genius and a business disaster, but he did design some of the most beautiful ball gowns for some of the wealthiest people in the United States. In any event, it's now, I guess, a little over 3 years since I was asked to head up the foundation on an acting basis, and the college then, when Hirschfield came, advertised in the New York Times for Vice President for Development / Executive Director of the Educational Foundation. I had been asked if I was interested in taking on that position on a full-time regular basis, and I declined, saying I felt the college needed a development person with lots of years of experience, with a track record of major fundraising, because I felt that the institution needed, things were changing. The 1990s have not been particularly good to the college. They've not been particularly good to higher education across the country. And the needs of the institution were quite different, and we needed, again, substantial additional funds to be raised. And that was not my area of expertise. I had no previous experience in development work at all. And while I loved working with the foundation, and I had enjoyed my stint relating to the industry board, I felt we needed a professional. So to make a long story short, the interview process led to one candidate being offered a position. And I remember it vividly. About 2 weeks before this gentleman was supposed to start, he called Hirschfield and indicated that he didn't think the job was doable. The resources weren't available. The structure wasn't in place, et cetera, and he declined the position. At that point, Hirschfield and Scottis approached me and asked me if I would take on the responsibility of serving as Vice President for Development and head of the foundation.
What's the major purpose of the foundation? If you could describe the structure of the foundation.
The foundation actually, most people at the college are not aware of this, but the foundation actually holds the charter for FIT. The Educational Foundation was actually formed, I believe, in 1942. This was basically the vision and dream of 12 to 15 industry people who felt that the industry needed its own college to provide trained personnel for the fashion and related industries. And they were really an extraordinary group of people who initially got the city fathers to agree, city fathers and mothers, if you will, to find space, which initially was at the top of the High School of Fashion Industries here on 24th Street. It was called Needle Trades High School at the time. And they provided, I believe it was $500,000 in seed money to cover the initial expenses of launching this new college. The city agreed at the time to subsequently take on the financial burden, responsibility, if you will, to fund the college. And so for a good number of years, the college operated with 10 faculty and a little over 100 students in borrowed classrooms on top of the high school. And it wasn't until, I think it was probably 10 years later, that the C building was built and finished, that the college had its own home here on 27th Street. But from the very beginning, the foundation played the major leadership role in terms of the initial development of the institution and its subsequent growth and development. The college over the years went through many changes in terms of having its own board of trustees, subsequently became part of the State University. But the foundation has essentially been the industry link for the institution. I think Shirley did an incredible job in terms of garnering industry's support for the institution, whether it was for new building programs, whether it was for growth and development of the institution, some fundraising, especially for scholarship money. The board has played a very major role in the history of the college. When Feldman had a vision for expanding the educational programs to encompass baccalaureate education and graduate education, he also used members of the foundation to help lobby the legislature in Albany on behalf of the college. So the foundation, again, has been, I think, the major force in terms of a lot of the new programs. A lot of the new majors were a byproduct of recommendations that came from the Educational Foundation. Many of the foundation board members through the years served on industry advisory committees that each department has. Clearly the Board of Trustees is responsible for setting policy. But if you look at the composition of the board, it doesn't begin to address the diversity of the institution from an academic standpoint. And so the foundation has essentially played that role. In the last 18 months, I've tried to reshape the board, if you will, to better reflect the academic changes and the new academic programs that have come online over the years. Because I found that the board, again, did not reflect what the institution needed. So in the past 18 months, about half the core board has been retired, and I have brought on an equal number of new board people who are the shakers and bakers, if you will, representing aspects of the industry that I think are very important to have involved with FIT. I can give you a few examples. The list is very long, since I'm talking about 36 new people. Rosemary Bravo, who's the president of Saks Fifth Avenue. Russell Lewis, who's the president of the New York Times. Jeanette Chang, who is the publisher of Harper's Bazaar. Joel Feigenbaum, who is the CEO of Century 21. David Chu, who's the CEO of Nautica, also an FIT alumnus. Robert Lee Morris, who's an eminent costume jewelry designer, who also is designing a lot of other product for the marketplace and is quite successful. Carol Lee Friedlander, who's also from the jewelry area. Again, if you look at the composition of the board 2 years ago and the composition of the board today, it is vastly different. And my objective is to get the board much more involved in the institution. A couple of meetings ago, I got the board to approve 5 new committees, because my feeling is that the only way to get these people really intimately involved with the college is to have them responsible for particular tasks. Fundraising is one committee. There's an education committee. I've met with the chair people of the art and design division and the chair people of the business and technology division to have them meet with their respective faculty members and view this list of 72 very eminent, high-powered industry people as resources to be drawn upon for lectures, for seminars for students, critics, etc. Because my feeling is these people do not need a free lunch 4 times a year, and coming to FIT should involve an intimate appreciation of the wonderful student body and the wonderful faculty we have here. And the only way they're going to develop this sense of commitment and attachment to the faculty and the students is for them to be, again, directly involved in some tangible educational activity going on at the college. We also raised a record-breaking amount of money at the last dinner dance. We, for the first time in the history of the college, netted over $1 million in one evening, which essentially goes to provide scholarships to the financially less advantaged students attending the college. One of my major goals and objectives for the years ahead is to have the endowment, which is currently at about $23 million, grow substantially, because the support from the federal and state governments for financial aid has been going down as the costs of education at FIT have been going up. And we traditionally have not catered to a particularly wealthy student body, and so a very large percentage of our students require financial assistance in order for them to get an education at FIT. So therefore, scholarship aid, I think, has to grow dramatically if we're to really make a big impact on helping students finance their education from college. So that's, again, one of the high priorities on my list for the foundation, as well as, again, getting the board more involved with the institution and therefore be more supportive and hopefully even more generous in the years ahead.
Maybe we could do, in the few minutes that are remaining, Would you like to give us a tour of some of the things you have in the room because they're part of FIT history? Like, I know you talked about your trip to China.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, that trip to China, I've traveled extensively on behalf of the college over the years and represented the institution in parts of Europe. I remember going over to Europe with Feldman and a group from FIT. We put on seminars in Paris, Florence. I've been to Russia on behalf of the college. I've been to China twice on behalf of the college. As a matter of fact, in 1992, I took 9 of our students and one staff person, Susan Robley, who's the Model Workshop Coordinator, on a fashion tour to 9 cities all over China. We played to audiences of 15 to 25,000 people who came to, again, sports stadiums to see the first Sino-American fashion show. It probably was out of my mind, taking on and sort of basically doing all the organizational work to make this project happen. I found taking students who've never been out of the United States on an extensive tour of China was worse than being a tour leader for a package tour, because quite frankly, despite my best efforts to orient the students to what they might expect in China, I guess it was like talking to a 13-year-old about sex who's never had sex. Within a very short period of time, they were having problems with the food. This one didn't have film, this one's camera was, I mean, whatever it was, I had carried the rolls of toilet paper and fresh drinking water and bananas and whatever. It was a wonderful trip. I mean, I'm sure in retrospect the students will probably develop fonder memories, but they had to work hard. It was an arduous trip. I think the Chinese are very famous for wanting to get every ounce of energy from consultants or people who are doing something in China, and I guess I can't blame them. But to do 9 cities in 5 weeks, 2 shows in each city, was a hell of a lot of work. But I think it was wonderful for the college. We got tremendous publicity all over China. I think it was wonderful from an educational standpoint in terms of students seeing China in a way that most people could never afford. The Chinese government was enormously generous in terms of accommodations, and I mean, we got into cities where we would have a motorcade with police cars with their sirens and their red lights on top of the cars flashing, because this was sort of a rather extraordinary event. And so I think in retrospect, it was wonderful for all concerned. This is a very long story, which we don't have time to go into, but the people in Hong Kong who were involved in the project ran off without plane tickets, and here I was with the students stranded in Shenzhen, China, with no valid plane tickets to get this group back. In the middle of the night, I was phone calling with Northwest Airlines, and I spoke to a senator's office in New Mexico, and then we had a 3-way phone conversation between Detroit, where Northwest has its home office, the senator's office in New Mexico, and here I am in a hotel room in Shenzhen, China, 3 in the morning, with students who already told their parents that they're stranded in China. I mean, it was a minor nightmare.
What year was this?
This was summer of 1992. I'll never forget it. But I did finally manage to get the group out through, again, the senator's office and Northwest Airlines, and getting across the border at 4 o'clock in the morning with all this luggage and students and no porters. By the time we got to Hong Kong, I was a washed-out coolie who was rather exhausted. But anyway, the students enjoyed the day in Hong Kong, which we weren't expecting. We were supposed to fly directly back from Beijing. But again, it was, I think, again, a wonderful experience for the students and certainly good for the college. And I think a lot of these international programs that we're involved with have basically